History is usually told as the story of kings and conquerors, the men who build empires with ambition and brute force. We know their names. We remember their battles. But so often tucked away in the shadows of these monumental men are the women who made them. These aren't just background characters. They are the architects of destiny whose strength and sacrifice were the true foundation of kingdoms. And since this month is Women's Month, it feels only right to shine a light on the women whose courage shaped history in ways the world cannot forget. This story is about one such woman. A woman whose life began in humiliation but ended in power. A woman whose resilience gave birth not just to a son but to a kingdom. This is the story of Queen Nandi, the mother who gave the world Shaka Zulu. But before we dive in, it's important to say this. History, especially African history, is often told differently in TV dramas, novels, or even classroom summaries. Those stories can blur the line between fact and fiction. What we're exploring here comes from historical research, oral tradition, and academic work, not dramatization. Of course, sources sometimes disagree, but this version is grounded in what the historians, anthropologists, and recorded oral histories tell us. So, if it feels different from what you've seen on TV, that's exactly why these stories need to be told. Okay, now back to the story. Nandi's name means the sweet one. But her life would prove anything but sweet. It was a story of rejection, endurance, and ultimately triumph. To understand her journey, we need to picture the world she was born into. In the late 1700s, the land we now call KwaZulu-Natal was not a unified country. It was a shifting patchwork of Nguni chiefdoms, small clans bound by kinship and cattle competing for survival. This was a world where cattle were currency, land was power, and tradition was law. Among the clans were the Nwandwa, fierce and ambitious under the leadership of Chief Swide. To the south were the Mthethwa, a clever and rising power guided by Chief Dingiswayo. The Kwabe, once powerful, were still influential. And then there were the Zulu, a small, relatively insignificant clan, hardly noticed among the great players of the region. It was into this world around 1760 that Nandi was born, the daughter of a minor chief of the Elandjini people. Being born into the family of a chief gave her some privilege. A childhood where she didn't have to work the fields as hard as others, where her family name carried weight. But it also came with expectations. From a young age, Nandi would have been taught the duties of a woman in her society, preparing food, tending cattle, raising children, and understanding the strict rules that governed social life. She was known for her beauty, but also for her sharp tongue and fiery confidence. This combination made her stand out, but it also made her a target in a culture where women were expected to be submissive. Still, her confidence was a sign of what was to come. In Nandi's world, a woman's value was tied to marriage and children. Families forged alliances by marrying daughters into other clans. And the transfer of lobola, bride price, usually in cattle, sealed the union. Lobola was not just payment. It was a sacred agreement, binding two families and ensuring respect for the bride in her new home. Sex before marriage was taboo. Yet, a practice called ukulobanga existed, a form of intimacy allowed for unmarried couples that stopped short of penetration. The rules were strict and breaking them carried heavy shame. This rigid system was meant to protect women's honor and preserve family alliances, but rules are rarely unbroken. Around 1787, Nandi crossed paths with Senzangakona Kajama, the chief of the Zulu clan. He was captivated by her beauty and spirit, and the two began a relationship that would soon shake both families. They engaged in ukulobanga, but their passion went further and Nandi became pregnant. In the world of the Nguni clans, this was nothing short of scandalous. To be pregnant outside the formal bonds of lobola and marriage was a deep shame. Whispers spread like wildfire, tarnishing her reputation. For Nandi, a chief's daughter, it was an especially harsh fall. When Nandi went to Senzangakona and his elders to acknowledge the pregnancy, their reaction was cruel. Senzangakona, cornered by the scandal, tried to escape responsibility with a lie. He claimed she wasn't pregnant at all, but simply ill from an intestinal parasite known as the Ishaka beetle, a sickness that caused bloating. It was a desperate attempt to save face, but it was also an insult. With that lie, Senzangakona branded her shame publicly, using the word Shaka as a slur. But Nandi was not a woman to be silenced. She and her family pressed the issue. As the months passed, the pregnancy became undeniable and the lie collapsed. The Zulu were forced to act. To avoid war with the Ilangini, Senzangakona's family had to pay heavy damages, 55 head of cattle. It was Nandi herself, bold and unafraid, who led the negotiations, demanding payment to restore her honor. Eventually, Senzangakona married her, but it was not a union of love and celebration. It was damage control. Nandi became his third wife, a low-ranking position in the royal household with none of the respect usually afforded to a chief's bride. In 1787, her son was born. And in a gesture both defiant and symbolic, Nandi chose to name him Shaka. She took the insult meant to disgrace her and turned it into a badge of resilience. If the world would call him the Beetle Boy, then so be it. The name would remind him and everyone else of the shame they tried to impose on them. It was an act of defiance, a declaration that she would not hide and that her son would not be defined by their cruelty. But as mother and child entered life in the Zulu royal court, they were about to discover that the road ahead would be far harsher than anything they had faced so far. Life in Senzangakona's royal court was meant to be a sanctuary, a place of protection for a woman married to a chief. But for Nandi it became a nightmare. From the moment she entered the household she was marked. The other wives saw her not as an equal but as a stain on the royal family. She was the woman whose pregnancy had forced Senzangakona into marriage. The third wife who carried none of the honor of her predecessors. Her presence was tolerated but never embraced. The contempt she endured was unrelenting. Women whispered about her, mocking her behind her back. Servants looked at her with disdain. Every day was a reminder that she was unwelcome. And the cruelty did not stop with her. Her son Shaka became the target of that same scorn. The other children picked up the insults of the adults, calling him the Beetle Boy, the fatherless one, mocking the very name his mother had chosen for him. To them, he was illegitimate, a living reminder of scandal. Senzangakona himself was distant, cold, and dismissive. He treated his son not as an heir, but as a problem. To him, Shaka was a symbol of humiliation, not pride. For young Shaka, growing up in such an environment was a daily battle. He was ridiculed, bullied, and sometimes beaten. Every slight reinforced the idea that he did not belong, even in his father's home. For Nandi, it was agony to watch. She defended her son fiercely, but her voice could not silence the whispers of a court determined to keep them both on the margins. Eventually, she could take no more. The isolation, the insults, the constant reminders of shame. It was unbearable. Gathering her courage, Nandi left the royal court and returned to her own people, the Ilangini, taking Shaka with her. At first, she must have hoped that home would bring peace, that her clan would embrace her and her son despite the scandal. But home had long memories, and scandal travels fast. The Ilangini too saw them as tainted. The whispers followed, the side glances stung, and Nandi realized that even among her own kin, she and her child were marked as outsiders. At times, Shaka was even left behind in the royal kraal while his mother sought refuge elsewhere. But the abuse only deepened in her absence. An uncle eventually brought him back to Nandi, recognizing that whatever else the boy faced, his best chance of survival was at his mother's side. But her side was not an easy place to be. The rejection never stopped. The two of them became wanderers, moving from one place to another, tolerated in some homesteads, but never fully accepted. They lived on the fringes, dependent on the charity of others, always reminded of their lower status. And then came famine. Around 1802, drought and hunger swept the region. Resources grew scarce, and communities looked for scapegoats to lighten their burdens. For the Ilangini, Nandi and Shaka were expendable. They had been tolerated before, but now with survival at stake, they were cast out completely. It was an unthinkable blow. Mother and son, already scarred by rejection, now faced starvation and homelessness. But Nandi was nothing if not resilient. She turned again to her willpower, determined to keep her son alive. She sought refuge with the Quabe, where she entered into a marriage with a man named Gendiana. For a time there was a glimmer of stability. She bore another child, hoping that perhaps here she could finally carve out a life of dignity. But stability was fleeting. The stain of her past seemed to follow her wherever she went. Even among the Quabe, whispers of her scandal and her son's illegitimacy resurfaced. Tensions grew, hostility returned, and once again, Nandi was forced to flee. The years that followed were harsh and unforgiving. She and her children endured hunger, danger, and endless rejection. They were pushed to the margins of society, living always on the edge of survival. Yet through it all, Nandi remained fierce. She fought for her son, defended him from bullies, and gave him the one thing no one else would: unconditional love. These were the years that forged Shaka into steel. The constant bullying taught him to fight. The endless hunger taught him discipline. And the cruelty of others taught him that the world respected only strength. But without Nandi, those lessons might have broken him. She was his anchor. She reminded him that his suffering was not proof of worthlessness, but a test. She taught him to see every insult as fuel, every rejection as a reason to rise higher. She made him believe that he was destined for something greater than the life the world tried to force upon him. The bond between them grew unbreakable. Shaka's love for his mother became something close to worship. She was the one person who had never abandoned him, the one constant in a life of betrayal and humiliation. Every insult hurled at her became a wound he carried. Every tear she shed became a debt he would one day repay in blood. This shared suffering shaped them both. For Nandi, it was a lesson in endurance. For Shaka, it was the fuel of destiny. Together, they weathered the storm of rejection and humiliation, their bond growing only stronger with each trial. And then, at last, after years of wandering, they arrived in the lands of the Mthethwa under the rule of a chief who would change their lives forever. His name was Dingiswayo. For the weary outcasts, this was more than just another place to rest. This was the turning point. The moment when Nandi and her son would step out of the shadows and onto the stage of history. When Nandi and her son arrived in the lands of the Mthethwa, it must have felt like stepping out of the wilderness into a place of hope. For years they had wandered, rejected, and humiliated, always living on the margins. But here, under the rule of Chief Dingiswayo, they found something rare: acceptance. Dingiswayo was no ordinary chief. He was a visionary, a leader with an eye for talent and an openness that set him apart from others. Where other clans saw Nandi and Shaka as tainted by scandal, Dingiswayo saw potential. He welcomed them into his territory, offering protection and dignity. For Nandi, this was a reprieve. For Shaka, it was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Shaka was conscripted into one of the Mthethwa military regiments known as an Ebutho. These were groups of young men trained in discipline, combat, and loyalty to the chief. At first, Shaka was just another recruit. But it did not take long for his presence to be felt. Years of hardship had hardened him. He was taller, stronger, and more determined than most of his peers. But it was his mind that truly set him apart. He studied battles, questioned traditions, and pushed himself harder than anyone else. While others were content to follow, Shaka sought to change the very nature of war. In traditional Nguni warfare, battles were often more about display than destruction. Warriors would hurl long-throwing spears at one another from a distance, and often conflicts ended with few casualties. To Shaka, this was wasteful and indecisive. He envisioned something different. Warfare that was direct, close, and devastating. He introduced a new weapon, the ikawa. This was a short stabbing spear with a broad blade designed for hand-to-hand combat. It got its name from the sound it supposedly made when pulled from a victim's body. Ikawa. Unlike the long, flimsy spears, the ikawa turned every warrior into a brutal fighter at close range. But Shaka didn't stop there. He also changed how warriors moved. He abandoned sandals, believing they slowed men down, and toughened his regiments by making them run barefoot across thorn-strewn ground until their feet grew hard as leather. He trained them to run long distances at speed, transforming the army into a force that could move swiftly and strike suddenly. And then came his greatest innovation, the buffalo horns formation. Instead of chaotic charges, he organized his warriors into 4 parts. The chest engaged the enemy head-on, pinning them in place. The 2 horns swept around the flanks to encircle them. Behind them, the loins waited as reserves, ready to reinforce or strike at the critical moment. It was disciplined, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. Word of his brilliance spread quickly. His regiment became known for its unmatched discipline and ferocity. And in time, Dingiswayo himself noticed. He promoted Shaka, making him a commander and soon one of his most trusted generals. For Nandi, this transformation was vindication. The boy who had been mocked as the beetle child, who had been rejected by both father and clan, was now commanding respect on the battlefield. She, who had endured the shame of his illegitimacy, now walked among them Thethwa as the proud mother of a rising star. It must have been deeply satisfying. Every insult, every whisper of mockery she had endured was now being silenced by her son's growing reputation. And Shaka never forgot why he fought. His victories were not only for himself, but for the woman who had protected him when the world turned its back. Then in 1816, the moment came that would change everything. Shaka's father, Senzengakona, died. Leadership of the Zulu clan passed to Shaka's half-brother, Sigajana. For many, this might have been the end of the story. The illegitimate son of shame staying in exile while another carried on the royal line. But Shaka was no ordinary man, and his time with Mthethwa had prepared him for something greater. With Dingiswayo's backing and the loyalty of battle-hardened soldiers, Shaka returned to the Zulu heartland. This time he did not come as a scorned outcast. He came as a conqueror. Sigajana's reign was short. Accounts vary, but what is certain is that Shaka seized power swiftly and ruthlessly. Some say he challenged his brother in combat and killed him outright. Others claim his supporters carried out the act in his name. Either way, Shaka emerged as the new chief of the Zulu. And at his side, sharing in this moment of triumph, was Nandi. The woman who had once been cast out as a disgraced third wife, now returned as the Queen Mother, the Ainlovakatsi, the great she-elephant. Her transformation was as dramatic as her son's. From a woman ridiculed and exiled, she rose to become one of the most powerful figures in the kingdom. Her position as Queen Mother was not ceremonial. Shaka trusted her completely, making her his closest advisor. In a kingdom where Shaka never married and never named an heir, Nandi's influence was unparalleled. The bond between them, forged in suffering, now shaped the destiny of an entire nation. Shaka's ruthless ambition and Nandi's resilience combined to fuel the rise of the Zulu kingdom. Every insult they had endured was now being repaid in conquest. For Nandi, this was vindication on a scale few could imagine. The woman who had once begged for dignity in the courts of men now sat at the heart of a growing empire, respected, feared, and honored. But their journey was not over. The rise of the Zulu was only beginning, and with power came both glory and peril. As Shaka set out to build his empire, Nandi stood beside him, no longer as an outcast, but as the great she-elephant, the matriarch of a kingdom. With Shaka on the throne of the Zulu, the destiny of mother and son was forever transformed. No longer an outcast, no longer the humiliated third wife, Nandi now stood as the Ainlovukatsi, the great she-elephant. In Zulu tradition, the Queen Mother was no figurehead. She was second only to the king himself, wielding immense political power. Nandi presided over her own royal kraal, controlled vast herds of cattle, and commanded respect as Shaka's chief advisor. Decisions of war, alliances, and governance often passed through her ears before they were acted upon. For a woman who had once been cast out, this was extraordinary. Nandi knew what it was to live without power, and she wielded her newfound authority fiercely. By all accounts, she had a formidable temper. Those who had mocked her and her son in their youth sometimes found themselves punished now that fortunes had shifted. Every slight, every humiliation was remembered. The debts of shame were repaid with interest. But her power was not only about vengeance. Nandi's influence gave the Zulu kingdom stability at a time of rapid expansion. Shaka was a brilliant general, a man consumed by ambition, but he could be ruthless to the point of instability. Nandi often acted as his counterbalance, tempering his fury, advising patience, and reminding him of the long view. In her presence, Shaka could still be the sun shaped by her love. Their bond remained the unshakable pillar of the Zulu state. Shaka revered his mother with almost religious devotion. He famously refused to marry, perhaps because no woman could ever challenge her place in his life. Any woman in his household who became pregnant was executed. A brutal policy designed to ensure no potential heir could dilute Nandi's influence. To Shaka, his mother was not only the Queen Mother. She was the embodiment of loyalty, sacrifice, and resilience. Together they presided over the transformation of the Zulu from a small clan into a mighty empire. Shaka's Mfikane, the crushing, sent shock waves through southern Africa as clan after clan fell before his armies. The Zulu kingdom became the most formidable power in the region, its regiments disciplined and feared. And at the heart of it all was Nandi, the great she-elephant, the matriarch who stood as a living symbol of survival and triumph. But even the strongest spirits are bound by mortality. On October 10, 1827, Nandi died reportedly of dysentery. For Shaka, it was not just the loss of a mother. It was the collapse of his entire world. The woman who had protected him, believed in him, and shaped his destiny was gone. His grief was so intense that it seemed to break something inside him. What followed became one of the darkest episodes in Zulu history. Overcome by sorrow, Shaka ordered a period of mourning unlike anything the world had ever seen. Crops were not to be planted for a full year. No milk, the staple of the Zulu diet, could be consumed. It was all to be poured onto the ground as an offering. Even more shocking were the decrees against life itself. Shaka declared that no new children should be born during the mourning period. Any woman who became pregnant and the man responsible were to be executed. The birth of life was in his eyes an insult to his mother's death. The stories of this morning are brutal, and though some may be exaggerated by later accounts, they remain etched in history. It is said that 10 of Nandi's handmaidens were buried alive with her, meant to serve her in the afterlife. A massive force of warriors, some say as many as 12,000, were ordered to guard her grave for a full year. Thousands of people were executed for failing to show what Shaka considered sufficient grief. For the Zulu people, it was a time of terror, a kingdom gripped by mourning turned madness. But it also showed the scale of Nandi's place in her son's heart. She was not just his mother. She was his anchor, the center of his existence. Her death left him unmoored. A king adrift in grief so consuming, it nearly destroyed the empire they had built together. In time, Shaka's excesses would lead to dissent among his generals and his assassination only a few years later. But through it all, the name of Nandi endured. Her story is one of history's most profound tales of resilience. She was a woman who endured humiliation, rejection, and exile, but turned suffering into strength. A single mother who against all odds raised her son to greatness. Without Nandi, there would be no Shaka Zulu. Without her courage, there would be no Zulu empire. She was the woman who gave the world a warrior king, and in doing so carved her own place in history. And this Women's Month, her story reminds us why we must celebrate the women who shaped our world. They were not merely supporters in the shadows of great men. They were builders, visionaries, and survivors who laid the foundations of nations. If you believe in the power of resilience, hit that like button, subscribe, and join us here as we uncover more incredible stories of African women who changed history.